What up, Cavs Nation? I'm your host, Ethan Sands, and I'm back with another episode of the Wine and Gold Talk podcast. I'm joined by your favorite beat reporter, Chris Fedor. What's going on, Chris? How you feeling after your flights today?
Ethan, man, I'm great. It's great to be home. It's great to be with the family. It was great to tell Elliot as soon as I walked into the door, Dada doesn't have to do any traveling for a long time. And it was also very nice to catch up on some sleep because I think I ended up going to bed at 5:30 yesterday, 5:30, and the alarm went off at 7:30. So pretty much running on fumes after the end of that series. But I'm refreshed, I'm recharged, I'm rejuvenated, and I'm ready to dig into everything that is this Cavs offseason because it is a very delicate one, but it's also very, very important.
It is going to be an amazing offseason because there's so many different delicacies that we can get into. But Chris, I wanted to get into some Hey Chris questions after the season has come to a close. And I want to preface this. I know people sometimes can like comment on our YouTube videos or on the podcast talking about audio levels and stuff. I got my mic back. We had some technical difficulties the last couple days, so no more comments about our audio quality and stuff like that.
Okay.
Had to play tinkering with everything in the background, try to figure out how to make it sound halfway decent without a mic. But, all right, Chris, we have not done a Hey Chris episode this week, so I hit the subtexters up probably about 30 minutes ago, and I was like, hey, we're doing something last minute. We want to get your questions. Let me know. And usually, Chris, it'll be like 5, maybe 10 people that'll comment in the next 30 minutes. It was like 20, 25. And I was like, oh, I don't know how many we're going to get to today because a lot of them have the same kind of ordeal. But let's get into it. So, the first question for today's Hey Chris episode comes from Martin in Cleveland. He said, after Evan's monster game, obviously he's talking about game 5, how do the Cavs see the next step in his development?
I think it's the same thing, to be honest with you. I think they understand that if there's any chance of a Jarrett-Evan pairing working, it's Evan extending his game out to the perimeter, being more of a stretch player, being more comfortable outside the paint where it's not as congested. And I'm not saying that the Cavs are even committed to Jarrett and Evan. There is a good likelihood that Jarrett has already played his final game with the Cavs. But if they don't feel like they're going to get the kind of return for a potential Jarrett Allen trade that would make them better, that would allow them to take another step forward, they're not just going to make a move just to make a move because there's noise around this team. You know what I mean? It has to be beneficial to them, their roster construction, and ultimately where they want to go. But whether Jarrett's back or not, the evolution for Evan Mobley is becoming more of an accomplished, more of a reliable offensive player. And that's adding different facets to his game. You're not trying to take anything away from him. You're not trying to tell him to not master the things that he's already great at. But it's trying to enhance his game. It's continue to get better as a passer because that was a skill set that he obviously was able to develop more this year, and the Cavs were able to take advantage of more this year. He had a career high in assists. It's continuing to be comfortable when it comes to rebounding and pushing in transition, initiating offense quickly. It's being more comfortable out on the perimeter. On the offensive end of the floor, it's becoming a more reliable, more consistent outside shooter. Three-pointer would be nice, but, a 15 to 18-foot mid-range shot, something that the defense would have to pay attention to, something that provides a different dynamic that the defense has to worry about so that it opens up other aspects of his game and other aspects of the Cavs game. That will be important as well. So for me, it's all about the shot. It's all about the reliability of it and the consistency of it, and whether it can be that level threat to a defense, and whether he can become the kind of scorer and the kind of offensive player that the Cavs need him to become, for them to lift their ceiling even more at that end.
Yeah, and I think my biggest thing for Evan also goes along with the shot, but just being able to create for himself, like being
Yep.
able to not only be in the low block, be in the post, and be able to post up and do those kinds of moves, but also having a different arsenal at the free throw line and be able to be at the high post and be able to do pick and pops at the mid range level and be able to just, it doesn't have to be like you gain handles over the offseason that you can just
Mm-hmm.
take anybody you want off the dribble. That's not what I'm saying. I'm more so saying, like, if he's able to face up and take a jab, take 1-2 dribbles and create a different shot for himself, create some separation rather than just running headfirst into the defense, I think that's something that will also elevate the game. But also, obviously, his 3-point shot, which he's been working on since earlier on this season, would be a huge lift for this team if he can begin to hit those on a more consistent basis. And in game 5, he kind of took an early 3, and my thought was he's not going to take any more because he just completely missed it. And I was like, okay, well, he's not going to take any more. And then he took 2 more. And I was like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, okay. So that's not only like a confidence thing, getting in the rhythm thing and seeing him not shy away from it, even if he doesn't hit the first one, which is something that we had seen earlier this season from him. But
Mm-hmm.
I think that's something that you can say is continuing to grow, just the confidence of Evan Mobley in a lot of different roles on this team.
I also think this is important to note too, Ethan. Sometimes teams focus so much on, okay, let's enhance this aspect of this player. Let's try and give him this particular thing in his bag. And it's like, the Cavs can't allow Evan to lose what makes him great and special, or potentially great and special. And they can't take away opportunities where he is most comfortable, right? It's clear that he's most comfortable at the elbow in. It's clear that he has grown in terms of facing up, putting it on the deck, that baby hook in the lane after a spin move, either with the left hand or the right hand, getting him on the move, things along those lines, letting him play from the pocket. So, like, you can't eliminate those things from his game that make him comfortable, that have an ability to make him special on the offensive end. That's how he was attacking Boston um, in game 5. He wasn't attacking Boston from the perimeter, right? He wasn't banging all these jumpers. He wasn't knocking down all these threes. They were using him in a variety of ways, and a lot of that was inside the paint and close to the rim. So there is a danger and there is a balance that comes with, okay, we want him to extend out to the perimeter. We want him to be more comfortable out there, but they still have to continue to give him opportunities to score the way that he did in game 5 against Boston. They can't just turn him into a perimeter, a sole perimeter guy, because that's not what could make him special. It's the perimeter game. It's the outside shot. It's the mid-range shot on top of those other things that we saw in game 5.
Yeah, and I think Jimmy Watkins, who's been on the podcast a good amount recently, I think he said it earlier in the podcast series when we were talking about different things and people that he could look at, like Kevin Garnett, Tim Duncan, guys that were 4s and then got moved to the 5 and were more defensive guys and then gained more offensive prowess. Like, those are different things that I think Evan can look at. But the next question, Chris, comes from Howard in Lyndhurst, and he says, "Hey, Chris, how do you think player development went this year?" And so I think we can skip Evan Mobley because we went into that pretty decent. But Darius Garland, Jarrett Allen, Isaac Okoro, Max Strus, who did you think had probably the better development of those guys, especially the ones that are potentially going to be here next season?
Yeah, I don't necessarily know that Max developed all that much. I think it was more about the opportunities that he was given and the ways that the Cavs were trying to use him compared to how he was used in Miami. And I think oftentimes, if you get more opportunities, if you can tap into different aspects of your game, production can probably follow that. Jarrett Allen was really good this year for the Cavs. He had a bounce back year, especially on the heels of all the stuff that was said about him, and all the criticism that he received following the playoff loss against the Knicks. For him to be as impactful as he was at both ends of the floor, he looked more comfortable with that face up mid range jumper. He looked more physical, stronger. He handled himself better in what could have been some difficult matchups for him in the past. He was a better passer this year than he has been in the past. So I don't know if that's necessarily what we're looking for here, but I did see some signs of growth from Jarrett that weren't related just to opportunity, more touches, things along those lines. I think there were different ways that he was able to attack a defense on the offensive end of the floor, that he just did not have, that the Cavs didn't have the option to go to in last year's playoff series against the Knicks. So I would say that he was a bright spot from that standpoint. And until the playoffs, like Isaac Okoro was shooting the ball with confidence. He was making threes at a higher mark. And it's always difficult, Ethan, when it comes to Isaac, because it is such low volume that we're judging with him when it comes to 3-point shooting. And the quality of look that he continues to get is going to be high because defenses continue to ignore him, because defenses don't believe that he can consistently make that shot and make them pay for a pack the paint, sag off of him strategy. But for Isaac to come into the NBA as a 29% 3-point shooter, a guy who would do all these pump fakes, all these hesitations, or just swing the ball quickly when it got to him for what would have been an open three. That's how he came into the NBA. And for him this year to get his volume up a little bit more and to shoot 39% from 3-point range, and add 3 more points per game to what he did last year. Like, I thought he found more of an offensive niche within this team where you started to say to yourself, okay, we understand what he brings on the defensive end of the floor. We understand how impactful he can be with that, how good of a finisher he is in transition, offensive rebounding, cutting, like little things like that. But you also saw a few offensive flashes that were a little bit different, that started to make you think, hey, in a 7-game series, maybe he's going to be more equipped to make that defense pay for that strategy. You know what I mean? And it just didn't materialize, especially in the series against the Celtics. Now, was that just a bad shooting slump at the wrong time? Was that just shot variance creeping in? Or was that just, another situation where it's a 7-game series and that becomes a weakness that the opponent can continue to exploit? But in the regular season, he was good. He had a bounce back season, I thought. And there were people around the NBA that during the season were saying, hey, this is a 3-and-D type guy. This is a guy who could be on one of the 2 all defensive teams. This is a guy who is headed toward restricted free agency where he's probably going to get $15 to $18 million annually. I don't know how much the playoff performance changed that. But he's still a young player, and he has shown growth when it comes to him becoming a more reliable outside shooter, a more reliable 3-point threat, even though he's not there yet.
Yeah, and I mean, everybody wants to talk about Isaac Okoro shooting, and I'm glad you touched on it, but I did not know how much of a transition monster he was, because he uses his strength that gets displayed on the defensive end on countless occasions, and then he'll also go to his a patented Euro step that I feel like he uses every single time he goes down the court
Mm-hmm.
on transition. And it's funny because it's like you know exactly what he's gonna do, but nobody can stop it. But yeah, just overall as a player, I think Isaac Okoro grew this year because of how his shot has improved once again. That's something that we've continued to see him work on relentlessly in the off season, during the season, and continue to just get better when it comes to percentage. And I mean,
Mm-hmm.
when we talk about the Boston Celtics and the Orlando Magic series, nobody really shot the ball really well against either of those teams. But
Right.
we can move on from that. Okay, next question. And Chris, don't shoot the messenger, man. I'm just reading the subtext questions. We're going in order. I'm trying to get to all of them. How does the team feel about Emoni Bates' season? Do they think he might be ready for a rotation spot next season? And I'm going to say this to begin. We continue to get questions about Emoni Bates and his readiness and his availability for the Cavs. And I really don't think, to say it in the nicest way, Emoni Bates is not ready for the NBA.
Right.
He is still developing, still growing. Could he end up being a pivotal piece in what they do offensively? Sure. But he's got the build of Evan Mobley, but not the size and the strength or the capabilities on the defensive end. Sure, he makes up for that somewhat on the offensive end, but we also know he's a streaky shooter. If he's hot, he's hot. If he's cold, he's cold. But I mean, he's a guy that was supposedly the sleeper of the draft when they got him and continues to develop and grow. It's hard because you know how bad he wants to be on the court with those guys. He makes it very clear with his cryptic texts or cryptic social media posts that he makes about the team and next year and all of those things. But Chris, what have you been hearing about Emoni and his future with the Cavs?
Look, this is the 49th pick of the 2023 draft. He was 11 picks away from not getting drafted. So we're talking about a young kid who needs to learn how to be a professional, a young kid who needs to understand day-to-day habits, diet, workout routine, all those different things that come with being a successful NBA player one day. But Emoni Bates was never drafted by the Cavs 49th overall to help the team in 2023, 2024. It was about the idea of somebody with his skill set, maybe possibly down the road hitting, maybe possibly living up to the talent that he has shown at various points throughout his basketball career. But if it doesn't hit, and if it never works out, and if he never gets an opportunity, then it was only the 49th pick. It was a low risk, potentially high reward draft pick, but it was never something where, okay, the Cavs were coming off being the 4 seed in the Eastern Conference, winning 50 plus games, came into this season looking to take the next step as an organization, looking to get out of the first round. They added Max Strus, they added George Niang, they added Tristan Thompson, all these different win now players. It was all about the development of Emoni Bates behind the scenes. Send him down to the G League, let him play through his mistakes, let him learn a bunch of different things about professional basketball. And maybe down the road, the Cavs will be rewarded for that particular investment. But like I said, there's a reason why he was the 49th pick. There's a reason why the Cavs put him on a 2-way contract. There's a reason why they want him to spend more time in the G League because there are still things that he needs to iron out. There are still things that he needs to learn. And he's just not anywhere ready to play for this team with these expectations, with this roster. You know what I mean? If he was playing in Charlotte, if he was playing in San Antonio, if he was playing in Detroit, then maybe possibly, maybe. maybe he would have gotten some meaningful playing time as a rookie. I don't think that's a guarantee just because of how young and raw he is. Um, but this is a team that is, you know, one of the 4 best teams in the Eastern Conference. Guys like him don't get meaningful minutes. It just doesn't happen. Not this early.
Yeah, I mean, he's 20 years old, and I think that's lost a lot, and I think you mentioned it really
Just
well.
turned 20 4 months ago.
Yeah, exactly. He just turned 20, and I think you mentioned it, there's things outside of basketball that he needs to learn about the league and get acclimated in. Somebody, I forget who it was, but somebody had mentioned that their first season was completely different from a college first season because that the timeline is completely different. The amount of games is completely different. The practices, the regimen, all of that is completely different from college. And to do that jump from college to the NBA and to get some minutes in the NBA, obviously they weren't meaningful, but I think what was really telling to me, at least, or I was hoping it was going to be telling to the fans, was the final game of the season against the Charlotte Hornets, when it was kind of an experimentation game. Here's the minutes you've been asking for. Here's a team that's probably playing with their C level, B level roster, and let's see what you're able to do. And Emoni Bates underperformed. He had multiple turnovers that looked like he was young and wasn't ready for the NBA. And this is no knock on Emoni Bates' talent or his ceiling, because he can and could grow up to be a great player in the NBA. But right now, next season, when you're thinking about a team that is trying to figure out if they're going to be able to hold on to Donovan Mitchell and contend for an Eastern Conference Finals and NBA Finals run, a 20-year-old who's still trying to learn himself and learn who he is in this league is not the right spot to be trying to mix and match different things. All right.
Yeah, so the only thing that I'll say about that last game of the regular season, it's a little bit unfair to Emoni, and I think the Cavs understand that they put him in an unfair position. They had nobody that could run the offense. They had nobody that could organize the team because Craig Porter Jr. was supposed to be out there on the floor with that group to finish the game, but he sprained his ankle. So Emoni was forced into a role that he should not have. Where he was the primary creator, where he was the primary ball handler. Part of the reason why the Cavs have him in the G League is so that he can understand, what is going to be my niche in the NBA if I do make it, and if I can find a role, and if I can find my way into the rotation. What is my thing that I can bring to the team? It's not going to be playmaking. It's not going to be initiating offense. It's not going to be running the offense in high pick and roll or anything along those lines. It's going to be as kind of like a shooting specialist, a spot up shooter, somebody who can threaten the defense that kind of way. And, for Emoni, throughout the course of his career, there have been times where he was just the man on offense. He was responsible for a lot of different stuff. Now he's learning how to be a quote unquote, I'll borrow a coaching term in the NBA, a quote unquote star in your role. You know what I mean? Not as many touches, not as high of usage, not all that much volume. Because in the NBA, you're not going to be a guy who's going to get, if he makes it to the NBA, you're not going to get 15 to 20 shots a game. That's not his reality. So how do I impact the game in a positive way? How do I find my way onto the court by doing other things unrelated to some of the stuff that made me the guy that I was at various points throughout my basketball career? And for him, in that final game of the regular season, it was just a really, really difficult spot because they had nobody, absolutely nobody, who could actually dribble the basketball and put them in the proper positions on the offensive end of the floor and just organize them. And it just looked way, way too chaotic out there.
100%. And this is the last thing I want to say about Emoni. The situation that he's been put in, organizationally, knowing that he can put butts in seats for the G League is also a move. Like we talked to some people in the Celtics media organization and talked about how Taco Fall kind of played that role when he was on the Celtics, putting butts in seats for the G League team for the Celtics, and also how Bronny James could be the same thing when he gets drafted, if he gets drafted. But I want to go back to a question or a comparison that I made earlier that kind of took from Jimmy Watkins. He made the comparison with Evan Mobley and Tim Duncan and all of those guys because a subtexter asked. This is Dave from PA. He said, anyone ever bring up Kawhi as a model for how Evan Mobley develops? Especially because Kawhi went from defensive specialist to offensive hub while the Spurs were competing for titles. Also, Pop anointed Kawhi as the next great Spur a couple of years before it happened. Of course, it's different because Kawhi came into an established title team. But do you think Kawhi is an example as far as something that Evan can grow into?
I don't, because I don't think he's going to have that same kind of usage. If you remember the NBA Finals where Kawhi was just shredding the Miami Heat and how he was doing that, sometimes it's about the how, sometimes it's about the why, right? Kawhi was doing that in high pick and roll situations, snake dribbles, mid-range pull-ups, but the ball was in his hands and he was kind of initiating offense. Yeah, there were times where he would be in the post against a mismatch and he would go to work. He would do a turnaround fadeaway or he would do a face-up jumper and stuff like that. But I remember Kawhi as the guy that Miami had no answers for in the high pick and roll situation. And I just don't think Evan is ever going to be used that kind of way. I think he'll be used as the roller. I think he'll be used to play out of the pocket. I think he'll be used at the elbows as an offensive hub. The guy that I bring up more often than anybody else is Bam. If he can be the centerpiece of a defense like Bam, where he can switch, where he can close out to the perimeter, where he can also protect the rim, and then offensively, he can be a hub from the elbow extended. I think that's probably, and we talked about it. Evan can probably do a little bit as he continues to evolve on the offensive end. Evan can probably do a little bit of damage inside on those spinning hooks, on post ups against smaller defenders. But that would be, and it is one of the guys that Evan has been studying. Bam makes a lot of sense to me as a comparison, and maybe Evan gets a higher ceiling than that. Because maybe he develops an offensive arsenal that extends out to the perimeter with his outside shot that is more reliable than somebody like Bam. But I think it starts there just in terms of how he would be used within the offense. And it's certainly not the way that Kawhi, to me, that Kawhi was used for the San Antonio Spurs or how he's used right now for the Los Angeles Clippers.
Yeah, and I mean, the first thing that comes to mind for me is strength when it comes to Kawhi Leonard and how he's able to assert his will in almost any situation. Like, we've seen him guard 7-footers. We've seen him be able to dribble and take on guards and just pound them into the paint. Like, and I don't think Evan Mobley has that same strength. I think he has more of a fluidity to his game that allows him to get into different niches in every game that doesn't really have the same mindset that Kawhi does. And obviously, as Chris said, the ball usage is completely different. But
yeah, I mean, I think it's more Chris Bosh. I think it's more Bam. I think it's more Kevin Garnett. I think that is more the model for Evan Mobley.
All right. Next question from Billy and BK. Do you know what BK is, Chris?
Maybe Brooklyn?
Maybe. But
maybe
he says, so a whole narrative was that JB wasn't great at in-game adjustments or playoff basketball, but we rebounded from 2 bad losses in Orlando. We, as in the Cleveland Cavaliers. And after game 1 versus Boston, so if he's still quote-unquote growing, did he make improvements, or is he still just a rebuilding coach?
I was having a conversation with somebody about this earlier today, Ethan, and if you look at the series against Orlando and you look at the series against Boston, um, look, when it comes to playoff basketball, you can point to various moments throughout the course of a series or throughout the course of a game where you don't like as a fan the things that your coach did for your team. So if you're a Cavs fan and you watch JB, there are going to be moments that he does something that you don't like, that you question. Guess what? Eric Spoelstra doesn't do everything right. Okay, Joe Mazzulla doesn't do everything right. The Oklahoma City head coach, who was coach of the year, hasn't done everything right. Michael Malone is a championship coach. He doesn't do everything right. I see fans in Denver wondering about his lineups and his rotations. So I think it's just baked in to a coach that there are going to be decisions. There are going to be moments throughout the course of a game that he does something that he thinks is best for the team that fans are like, huh? What are you doing, dummy? And that's just the nature of the job. But I think people in Cleveland are harder on JB because they watch him closely, because they don't see the same flaws from afar in these other coaches. And they just assume that all these other coaches make the right moves, do the right things. Did Jamal Mosley make all the right moves in the series against the Cavs in the first round? No. He started Jonathan Isaac for the first two games, and that gave the Cavs a distinct advantage underneath. He fixed it. He fixed it going into game 3, but you could argue that he didn't fix it quick enough, that he should have fixed it after game 1. You know what I'm saying? So it's just because you are a Cavs fan and because you watch every single Cavs game, the flaws are going to become more apparent to you. Just understand that. Beyond that, Ethan, I don't look at this series against Boston or the previous series against Orlando and say, you know what? X coach would have made a significant difference in the outcome of that series. I don't look at those two series and say, you know what? JB didn't acquit himself well enough. He was a problem for the Cavs. I just didn't see that evidence. Now, you might sit there and you can say, well, he didn't do enough to benefit them. He didn't do enough to help them. Okay, I think we're splitting hairs, and I think we're drawing at straws there at that point in time because he tried a bunch of different lineups. He tried a bunch of different guys coming off the bench. He didn't have Jarrett Allen. He didn't have Donovan Mitchell for the final two games. He had Dean Wade on a minute restriction. Karis LeVert was not effective. Darius Garland was up and down. So it's like, what did you want him to do to better position the Cavs to compete with the Celtics in that series? There's nothing really glaring that stands out to me. The one question that I think lingers with JB, coming off these back-to-back playoff appearances, can he design a creative enough offense, a dynamic enough offense when it comes to playoff basketball to make it so that it doesn't feel like so much of a chore? Can he find a way to make it easier on his players on the offensive end? Like that to me is a pretty important question moving forward with JB. Beyond the question of, do the guys believe in him enough? Do the guys think that his system works? Do the guys think that his style works? You know, that's a big part of it too. But there's just nothing that stands out to me as a glaring issue if we're just looking at these last two playoff series against Orlando and against Boston. That you would label, okay, that's a fireable offense, or he did not grow from that Knicks series. I do think he grew from that Knicks series. I do think he made some pretty difficult decisions that weren't necessarily the most popular ones, because he thought it was what was best for the team in that given moment. So this is all a long way of saying that I think it's fair to criticize him. I think it's fair to have questions about him. But I don't think he showed himself as an incapable playoff coach, at least in this playoff run against Orlando and Boston.
I think my take on this is kind of funny because when you look at that first round series, there were adjustments that could have been made, lineups that could have been changed, things that he did try to do. But it felt like every move that Jamal Mosley made was in reaction or changing because of something that JB Biggerstaff was not capable of doing. And that was either taking Jonathan Isaac out of the starting lineup and placing Wendell Carter back, and how that changed the entire series. And I think the series that the Cavs won, the game, if they would have lost Game 7, I think there would have been a lot of conversation that JB Biggerstaff got outcoached by Jamal Mosley because of how good of a series Jamal Mosley had. And that's not a knock on JB Biggerstaff and what he was able to accomplish in the second round, because I'll get to that in a second. But knowing that Jamal Mosley was just calm, collected, and trusting in his guys and willing to understand that they knew that if he needed to make a change, that they were going to be okay and accept it rather than be upset at the organization or the team or whatever. But then you look at the second round series against the Boston Celtics, and it didn't feel like JB Biggerstaff got outcoached by Joe Mazzulla. It just felt like the Celtics had a better team. They just had a better group of guys to build around in the first place. And we've talked about that at an abundance. So, I mean, I think it was a hard situation. I think you look back at that first round series and think like JB Biggerstaff could have done maybe some things differently, but just the schemes that Jamal Mosley put into place were hard to kind of counter.
What did Jamal Mosley do in that series that was so impressive to you?
I mean, I think the biggest thing is just being able to take Jonathan Isaac out and put Wendell Carter back in.
That was their starting lineup for the majority of the season. That's not some big chess move.
Right. No, but I'm saying for him to have put Jonathan Isaac in, thinking that was going to help change something in their lineup, and then noticing that was not the case, and then making the adjustment to go back to Wendell. Because, like, if you say you're going to be my guy in the playoffs because this team does X, and then you say, sorry, you're not doing enough, I'm going to take that from you, I don't think JB Biggerstaff would have had the opportunity to do that because of how he manages the emotion of his roster.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't see it. I think you're giving Jamal Mosley a little bit too much credit. Their offense was terrible. All they did was run ISO over and over and over again. There was nothing creative about the things that they did on the offensive end of the floor. It took him multiple games to put Jalen Suggs on Donovan Mitchell. He used Cole Anthony at various points, who completely got obliterated by Evan Mobley in switches. He was stuck in the paint as opposed to out on the perimeter. So I don't know. I didn't look at that series. He looked completely overmatched by the moment in the first two games of the series. I don't look at that series saying that was advantage Jamal Mosley, or anything that he did really stood out from a coaching perspective that made the Magic more competitive. I just did not see it that way. And this is kind of what I'm talking about when it comes to the over evaluation of what you see repeatedly. And I think when you're talking about such a small sample, it was 7 games of seeing Jamal Mosley compared to all of the games that everybody watched with JB. And you're going to be harder on the people, and you're going to see the flaws a little bit easier when you have such a large sample size and you have so much of a critical eye toward that specific team or toward that specific person.
And I mean, I think we talked about it, Chris, when you're talking about the matchups of Jalen Suggs versus Gary Harris and having to guard whichever. Obviously, Gary Harris was injured for one of the games that Jalen Suggs switched on to Donovan Mitchell. But that was
Right.
something that we had talked about during that series, that we understood that Jalen Suggs disrupting Darius Garland would affect the entire offense because of how much he had the ball. And Gary Harris was going to be able to do a halfway decent job on Donovan Mitchell. Donovan Mitchell still is Donovan Mitchell and was the only person that was able to score or contribute on multiple games of that series for the Cavs. So I think that's a different sample size as well because of how many shots he was taking versus everybody else on the court, all of those things. But
his team also blew an 18-point lead in Game 7.
That's fair. That's fair. I'm just saying from my perspective of the being able to switch out people because of like emotions surrounding it. I think that's JB Bickerstaff's biggest caveat. Like, he's great with managing emotions of the team, but sometimes that can come into his decisions on the floor. And I think we've seen that, and he's talked about it as well. He did it after Game 5 of the Boston Celtics series.
Look, I mean, he went away from Niang, right? That's a difficult, delicate situation. That's a tough decision to make. He went away from Karras in Game 6 for the entire second half because Karras it looked like he was on a completely different planet in Game 6 against Orlando. He changed up his rotation at various points early in the Boston Celtics series because the non-Donovan Mitchell minutes were so bad. So one time he tried one lineup, another time he tried another offensive-minded lineup because he needed a little bit more offensive juice. So I think he was willing to try different things. I think he was willing to make the difficult emotional decisions. And I think some of them certainly benefited the Cavs moving forward as the playoffs progressed anyway. Let's put it that way.
I think we'll have to agree to disagree on that one, but that's fine. That's what we're supposed to do on this. All right. Next question is from Mike in San Diego. And this comes back to Jarrett Allen and his availability throughout this entire series since he was out after Game 4 after getting a rib contusion against the Orlando Magic. Chris, thinking about Jarrett Allen and him being questionable for every single game afterwards, this subtexter asks, Jarrett Allen and his lack of toughness during the playoffs. Are there any comments that you have? Everyone in the postseason has something they are battling, but for him to miss 7 games over 2 weeks is ridiculous. Also correlates to his lack of toughness last year. And I wanted to start by saying that I don't think this is a toughness thing, but there have been reports that Jarrett Allen didn't do as much as he could have to get back. But I think
that's up to each individual player.
Right. And I was about to say, I think him trying to come back from a rib injury that not only makes it hard to breathe, but to do any facet of the game that he is asked to do for the Cavs was always going to be a long stretch. Like, we've talked about it on constant occasion, him having to just raise his arms, setting screens, getting hit in the ribs when he gets setting screens, all of those things. I don't think it comes down to toughness, but what have you been hearing about the situation, Chris, and any comments that you might have?
Look, the only thing that I've heard is that there were grumbles behind the scenes about the whole situation with Jarrett. And I get that. I do. All I'm saying is I am never going to be the person, and maybe people want me to be the person that does this, but I'm not going to be that person. I'm never going to be that person. I am not questioning a guy if he chooses not to play a basketball game, because it is not my body. I have no idea what they're going through. It's not my pain threshold. It's theirs. I don't understand the same ramifications in the same way that they do. So I am not going to question a guy who chooses not to play. That's not going to be me. That's not going to be me on this podcast. That's not going to be me on cleveland.com writing about that. If Jarrett Allen did not feel good enough to play in the game, if he didn't feel like he could be effective enough while playing through this particular injury, I am not going to hold that against him. I'm not going to condemn him for that. I'm not going to question his toughness because of that. I'm not going to question his decision-making. we're all responsible for making those own determinations when we're dealing with those things. And I don't think it's fair when people start questioning those things of other players because they are not them. It is not their body. It is not their pain tolerance. There is an intimate knowledge that people in the Cavs organization, including Jarrett Allen, have of his specific injury, of the specific situation that we do not have. We do not. Fans do not. I do not. You do not. So I am never going to be the person that questions or wonders, should a guy be playing? Should a guy not be playing? Or make some impassioned take about that kind of situation. He chose not to play. I respect his decision on that. That's it.
All right, Chris, we're getting to the end of the podcast now, and all of the rest of the questions circulate around Donovan Mitchell and Darius Garland. And I wanted to know, is that something you want to touch on now, or you want to wait until more information comes out?
No, I mean, I think it's fine. It's a question about fit. It's a question about blending skill sets the proper way. I had a conversation with somebody for about 25 minutes before game 5 about the viability of Darius and Donovan together. And it doesn't have to be a situation where they don't like playing with one another. One's represented by CAA and the other one's represented by Clutch. And there's just not enough room within the organization to have two guys that want to be the franchise. It doesn't have to be that. It can just be a stylistic on-court conflict that you feel is problematic for this team. And I think there are times where Darius and Donovan are really, really good together. And it benefits the Cavs greatly to have multiple playmakers, multiple creators, multiple initiators of offense. But I think it's fair to wonder, is it the best situation for Darius? Is it the best situation for Donovan with them two together? And is it the best situation for the Cavs with those two guys together? Or is there just too much of an on-court conflict? Is there just too much of duplicating skills? Is there just too much of not enough size when it comes to the defensive end of the floor? Is it a situation where it becomes my turn, your turn on the offensive end of the floor? To me, when it comes to constructing a roster, it's trying to find the secret sauce and blending a bunch of different personalities and blending a bunch of different skill sets. And I think there are legitimate questions about the stylistic basketball fit of Darius and Donovan if we're talking about moving forward and what's best for the Cavs in that situation.
Yeah, and I mean, there's so much conversation about liking and disliking and locker room talk and all of this stuff. And I'm like, we can be in the locker room for like an allotted period. So if we can't, we don't get all the conversation. We don't hear all the speculation and all of those things. So like, as much as we get to talk to the players and understand what they want to talk about, that's also what they want to tell us. And some things are different being said in the organization rather than what's being said to us. And like we said all season, that's called coach speak. and it's used by players too. So I think we can talk about the fit, the personalities, the ability to play with one another. But knowing how each other feel about each other and organization and agencies and stuff like that, that's a whole different thing that I'm not ready to get into yet because we just simply don't have that information on paper. The only thing that we know from Woj and ESPN, who just put this out earlier today, said that he texted Donovan Mitchell personally, and Donovan Mitchell said that he is happy in Cleveland, which is something we have been telling y'all all year. So I think it's good to end the conversation there and say that we'll come back if more information comes out. But as of right now, go ahead, Chris.
I also wrote that overnight. I wrote that in my piece, preparing everybody for this offseason and how critical this offseason is. There is a specific line in my story about Donovan being happy in Cleveland, saying repeatedly, publicly and privately, how happy he is in Cleveland and how much he believes in the direction of this organization. Like, that has been clear, that has been evident since day one, that has been well documented. I don't know why he felt it necessary to come out and say that again in a different platform, maybe because the Cavs didn't have, end of season press conferences with the players the way that they have in the past, because they're not required by the NBA to do that. So maybe Donovan would have made that known if he would have had that platform to do it. If the Cavs would have had those end of season press conferences, Donovan probably would have been asked about his future in Cleveland, and he would have said on the record again, I'm happy here in Cleveland. I'm happy here in Cleveland. But because that didn't happen today, maybe he felt it necessary in the aftermath of everything from overnight following Game 5 that he wanted it out there. But I specifically wrote that today. That's not the piece of the story that I wrote that went completely viral on social media and got blown completely out of proportion. But I wrote that Donovan has expressed his happiness in Cleveland, and he has expressed his confidence in this organization and the direction of this organization. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't points throughout the course of the season where he was frustrated with certain things that he saw, certain things that happened with the team, certain stretches of the season, certain ways that people were acting and approaching things. All of that happens throughout the course of an 82 game season. But just because those things do happen throughout the course of an 82 game season doesn't mean that a guy is suddenly unhappy in his situation or he's looking for an exit strategy or something like that.
All right. But until next time, that'll wrap up today's episode of the Wanna Go Talk podcast. But remember to become a Cavs insider and interact with Chris and me by subscribing to Subtext. That will be the place. If we hear anything about Donovan Mitchell, Darius Garland, Evan Mobley, Jarrett Allen, that'll be the place that we hit you up first. So, to get all that information, sign up for our 14-day free trial or visit cleveland.com/Cavs and click on the blue bar at the top of the page. If you don't like it, that's fine. All you have to do is text the word STOP. It's easy, but we can tell you that the people who sign up stick around, because this is the best way to get insider coverage on the Cavs from me and Chris. This isn't just our podcast, it's your podcast. And the only way to have your voice heard is through Subtext. Y'all be safe. We out.